Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked about media protection last time. Today, we're talking about personnel security. Based on a conversation I had with CISO about how they have a former government agency employee handling their ongoing personnel security. But before we get to that, a friend of mine who works in the aerospace industry and who says that spreadsheets are still, unfortunately, his life, recommended some local beers from the Pacific Northwest. He gave us 4 cans, and I sent another 4 cans to you. What's funny is he said I'd hate one of the 4. So today's episode is a bit of a roulette spin to see if I regret asking for his beer recommendations. What are we drinking today, Tom?
We are drinking a Raspberry Goes. So that's the can. It's by Kolshan Brewing Company, which I believe Kolshan is up in your neck of the woods.
They're in my hometown, actually, of Bellingham, Washington.
Awesome.
The city of subdued excitement.
Goses are usually a very drinkable beer. They tend to move towards the sour. Traditional Goses aren't nearly as sour as the ones you seem to find today. They're often paired with something else from the fruit or sometimes vegetable variety. So you can get a cucumber Gose occasionally, which is actually pretty good. And they're usually, like 50% or more malted grains. So I see this one is heavily wheat malted. And
this is a raspberry Gose as well. I think he'd mentioned that this is using local raspberries. And before the show, Tom and I were talking, and Whatcom County, where I live, actually produces between 85 and 95% of the red raspberries in the United States. So if you've had a raspberry smoothie today, or if you've got some frozen raspberries, or if you have fresh raspberries you just bought at your grocery store, odds are I know where they came from, and it's about 10 miles that away. Where the fields are.
See, I think of Washington as a cherry capital, not as a raspberry capital. So
that is the desert side on the other side of the Cascades.
All right.
We do not grow cherries on my side of the mountains.
We learn something new every day. Well, I'm going to crack
this
beer.
Well, let's crack this open and see how it goes.
I don't smell much raspberry.
It's sort of pinkish, at least, on account of it's got raspberries in. Well. And I'm managing to fit this entire one in the glass. I prefer this size of can as opposed to the tall boys. Which,
so this has it has very small bubbles. It's almost like an effervescent bubble.
Oh, geez, wow, there's stuff floating. I'm not sure if that'll come through in the camera, but there's like chunks in the glass.
I don't have that, Kayne, if I'm being honest. So.
Oh, good time. So I'm guessing these are like raspberry seeds. Like maybe they didn't strain it all.
I didn't straight dump mine, so this could be that it's in mine. But there's some interesting.
Now this does smell like raspberries.
I do smell a raspberry. I get a little
bit of that beer smell. You're right, though. Very small bubbles, like almost a champagne bubble size, like small, but they're not going. They're not going straight up though.
And they disappeared
kind of cloudy.
Quick. So it's
no kidding.
It's very cloudy, very hazy. I'm gonna try it.
Yeah. All right. Same. So
you definitely get the raspberry flavor.
Oh yeah, Oh gosh. You know those Sour Patch Kids things or any other sour candy? Like this kind of reads like that, and I'm not a fan of sour things, as I think we're learning on the show.
Yes,
I like bitters, but I don't like sour.
The sour is pretty. If you're a fan of sour beers, you wouldn't call this particularly sour. It's pretty thin, so it's not.
Well, I will give you that. This is not one of those ones where you tell me it coats the tongue, and I after the show get a tongue brush and try and get the rest of it off.
Yeah.
But it does taste of raspberries.
Yeah, if you like raspberries and you like sours, I think you will really like this beer. This is, a healthy dose of raspberry flavor. I like it.
I've been to their brewery too, not for their beer, but for their cheese curds and what is that? Poutine. I recommend their poutine more than I recommend their beer. That is a true story there about being near Canada. Well, I wanted to to finish the story about the intro about the CISO that I know. Because while most people in cybersecurity industry are familiar with the concept of a background check, my understanding is the CISO's company goes a little step further. Their head of security actually uses a combination of open source intelligence and proprietary sources to vet anyone who wants to work in their FedRAMP environment, because their particular organization is concerned about espionage by adversarial nation states. The CISO mentioned that includes not just looking through court records, but also bank statements and social media to help determine if anyone's a potential blackmail risk. So, with that in mind, Tom, what is personnel security?
Well, you certainly pulled the covers back a little bit already, Kayne. This is all of the formal process you have around the people you bring into your organization, certainly how you vet them initially, how you make sure that as they move about inside your company, they move with the proper permissions and shed the ones they no longer need. Certainly talks about how you terminate an employee too, and what are the requirements around that. There are a couple things that I would consider maybe surprises to folks that are in the spec as well. First being, this also talks about external personnel that work in the environment, so you have to account for
like
those
contractors.
Folks. Yep, you got it. It talks about position descriptions and putting risk values on every employee as well that works in the environment. So those are things that I would say are going to be a surprise, but largely the rest of this fits pretty neatly into common controls that you would have in your organization.
Okay, and so how do organizations typically establish personnel security policies and procedures to meet those requirements of FedRAMP Moderate?
Yeah, good question. So most organizations will have what I would call fairly informal process around this already. So it's really about formalizing processes that may be otherwise informal, and then maybe notching them up in terms of scrutiny, due diligence, and documentation. So you're going to want to look at how you bring employees in today and document that and cross-reference it against the FedRAMP standard and say, where do I have a gap? It's like we've done with every control family so far, right? I will say that typically these are going to be more established in organizations than a lot of the other control families that we come across. So it's not going to be a tremendous lift. I've talked with our internal HR. We have to uplift slightly some of the things that we do, and we have to formalize documentation that was otherwise informal. Otherwise, we had most of these in place already.
Oh, that's good. And part of this reminds me of working with financial organizations when I was doing both consulting as doing executive advisory, but also when I was running professional services. Whenever we wanted to send somebody on site into a fintech or a financial institution, they would go through additional layers of background screening, not only from our company, but also from the client's company, which in some cases I had consultants on teams who were like, nope, sorry, don't ever put me at a fintech. I don't want to go through that level of scrutiny because of effects on their credit scores. But I want to ask you, Tom, what are some common screening procedures or background checks that are used by organizations that will meet those personnel security control family requirements?
Sure. There is different levels of scrutiny that you have to consider depending on what level of FedRAMP you're going through. So we're going through moderate. So I'll talk specifically about moderate. We have to make sure that we do a background check and an identity verification check. So do we know that the person has been, clean record through his career, and do we know that this person is who they say they are, essentially? Now, as you indicated, some organizations take it steps further, and you are absolutely encouraged to do so with FedRAMP. So it's not, it may not be explicit, it's encouraged. So you might do a credit
encouraged,
check.
But not a hard requirement, for example. So you don't have to do like a hard credit check then.
Correct. But you might want to consider it. And I think it's very appropriate, depending on the type of business you do, to take that additional step. So for instance, if we were a processor of financial transactions, through our platform, I would want to move it forward and do that as well because of the chance of malfeasance occurring in that sort of scenario. Now, if you talk about what it means if you process sort of critical high data in terms of government data, you're talking about probably going to a FedRAMP high status rather than moderate. And you're going to have to reassess your individuals on really a scale depending upon the kind of data you store. So if you're highly classified data, you're going to have to revet your employees every 5 years. If it's top security, it's going to be every 10, and so on and so forth. It goes down the line to, I think, 15 years total. So just be aware that would happen. Underneath moderate, there is the odd potential to have LEO, our law enforcement organizations, underneath your banner. And if that happens, you will have to revet every 15 years, I believe.
Okay. But otherwise, under FedRAMP Moderate, we're not having to do anything. Like, no one will need to have a security clearance.
That's right. We don't anticipate any security clearances. Of course, if we get that kind of customer base, we will pivot to meet that need. We will do things annually to provide diligence to our employees, which would be including things like continued training, which is a requirement underneath this anyway for security personnel, but we do it for all our employees. Every, I think, 3 years, you have to redesignate the risk level for every employee that works in the environment. So we will do that, and which means as we do that, we may change controls around an individual based upon a new risk profile that we uncover. So there are things that you will do that this policy covers, but it's not the kind of diligence that you'd have at initial hiring.
Fantastic. And if you're enjoying this conversation on YouTube, ring the bell to get notifications about our continuing attempts to find any beers I like, or just subscribe in your podcast app of choice. Now, Tom, I want to ask about how organizations ensure that their personnel are adequately trained in security principles and practices, which is part of the personnel security control family in FedRAMP Moderate.
It is. It specifically calls out that anybody who has responsibilities for security or privacy needs to have ongoing training. I take the stance that everybody has information security responsibility and privacy responsibility in the organization. So we take that to mean that essentially that this policy dovetails right into our security awareness training policy. That policy does designate different levels of training. So we have the security awareness training that is all our employees, and then we have another heightened level for people who have specific responsibilities in information security, meaning they're on the CERT team, they might be on the BCP team or something like that.
Okay, so additional training based on individuals' roles. Can you talk a little bit about the role of ongoing personnel security assessments and how they contribute to an organization's overall security posture in a FedRAMP Moderate environment?
Well, again, when you're talking about ongoing personnel assessments, you're really talking about what are the things that your policy requires you to do to make sure your individuals are continuing to be at the same level of security awareness and training. So there's not a secret sauce here. This is, do you reassess your employees on a given cycle to know what their risk profile is? Do you provide them information security training that's appropriate for their job role and function? And then if the profile of risk changes, do you put controls in place that are appropriate?
Okay, fantastic. And when you say personnel, like individual risk, do we mean to the role or do we mean risks by an individual?
Well, I think it's both. So you have to consider that an individual in a given position has inherent risk because of the role, but also because of factors in their life or their trajectory from a career perspective. So you bring all those into the risk profile. So for instance, if you bring in a brand new employee and give them a bunch of access, I think the risk is you don't know that employee well enough yet. So you have to judge that risk a little higher than somebody you've known for a number of years or has sort of scaled into that role. Now, that's just an example. Again, if your CFO suddenly becomes your CEO, there's a different risk profile associated with that individual as well. Maybe it's less because the CFO has a lot of keys that the CEO shouldn't necessarily have in his pocket. So the reality is you have to look at it based upon the company and the profile of the company and how it's ran, look at it by the position and look at it by the individual.
Okay, and so getting more to brass tacks then, how do organizations ensure that proper separation of duties and responsibilities within their personnel to minimize the risk of unauthorized access to information systems in that FedRAMP moderate setting?
Yeah, great question. Of course, initially you're talking about how do you set up an employee, right? So you should have
Hmm.
the principles of least privilege installed from the very beginning. So this talks about onboarding an employee, and it dovetails
Hmm.
directly into processes that we have for onboarding an employee. Always we onboard with the idea that we should give this person the least privilege that they need to do their job. That's a
Hmm.
information best practice. Now the next
Oh,
step of
definitely.
this is as you move through an organization, you get promoted, you fill a gap in a different group, whatever it is, you need to have your permissions relooked at. And this talks about that too. There's timelines. I think it's within 24 hours of the acceptance in the actual move to the new role. So, for
Hmm.
instance, if you were to take a job on and it doesn't start for 2 weeks, you don't have to remove permissions in that period. But once that 2 week period starts or ends, I should say, you have 24 hours to remove old permissions that are no longer required, and then you have
So
to
that's
announce
good
it.
because I found a lot of organizations just historically have struggled with permissions aggregation and with removing people's permissions. I can think of a couple instances where we found out that the CEO had access to literally everything because, as the founder of the company, many years ago, they just had never had anyone clean up their permissions. So it sounds like in a FedRAMP moderate environment, those rule changes are far more prescriptive and in line with best practices.
100%. And I think you're exactly spot on, Kane. I don't think I've been to a large organization in my career that hasn't struggled with this. So
Hmm.
this is really forcing the hand of organizations to do what they should have always been doing.
Okay, and just going on those other challenges because we've seen this before, Tom. Both you and I'm sure our viewers have as well. What are some other common challenges organizations face when they're trying to implement the personnel security control family in their journeys towards FedRAMP moderate compliance?
Yeah, I would say this one is going to offer fewer challenges than some of the other ones. There's not big technical hurdles here, so you don't have to worry about, for instance, in our stance, we don't have to do much in terms of product enhancement for this policy to be active, right? What you do have
Mm-hmm.
to do is formalize activities that impact functional groups across the organization. So HR is going to head up the adoption of this policy, but there's going to be potentially pillars within your organization that resist that change, right? To your point, you may have a CEO that doesn't want to have his permissions removed, or you might have, a director of infrastructure that started as a tier one knock person and has just kept all those permissions, and he likes to be able to go in occasionally and look at Active Directory or whatever it is, right?
Sounds so familiar.
Right. So the big challenge you're gonna face here is change, and that's a challenge in every organization. I think we all recognize that, but this is a necessary change.
So it sounds like there's going to be some cultural changes associated with this as well, not just. So it's more about soft skills in this rather than necessarily hard technical requirements.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, fantastic. Well, with that, I want us to move to our beer reviews associated with Culshan's Raspberry Goes. I
Let's
guess I'll
see.
goes first. Perhaps I'm going to take one more sip, see if it's changed. The raspberry flavor scent has come far more prominent now over time. So here's where I'm going to come down on this one. I'm going to give this possibly my highest rating. I'm going to give it a 5 out of a possible 10. And the reason why is it's very thin. It does not have a prominent, unpleasant aftertaste. I happen to like raspberries, and because this is not as sour as some of the other things I've drank on this show, this is genuinely not terrible. So I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10.
Good rating. I think it's no secret to anybody that sours aren't my favorite. But in terms of sours, this one is not the most sour. I mean, it's pretty drinkable. You mentioned thin as a plus. I mentioned thin generally as a minus. But I do like the raspberry flavor. So this one has a convoluted set of variables in my head. I'm going to probably go with you and say it's a 5. I'm not going to ever.
Really? We agreed?
We agree.
Wow.
I'm never going to search this out. But when somebody says, hey, have you ever had a good goes? I will rate this up there with the cucumber goes that I get locally. That's very good. It's a little less sour, so it's probably a little better. But this is a close second. For a goes, this is pretty good.
Fantastic. Well, we both agreed on this one. And that's all for today. If you have a beer you think I'd like, drop it in the comments below. And remember to subscribe to Top 5 and 5 for a show where I talk about macroeconomic factors and regulatory changes in security. Thanks, everyone.